Good evening to the president, the provost, deans, faculty, and students of this wonderful institution. I am deeply honored and quite thrilled to be giving the Luther Lee Lecture this year. I have had a fabulous day today. I've spent the day with faculty, and many of you students have had a chance to listen to your fabulous minds working, and you are a wonderful group. I am so excited to see what you're going to do when you finish your 4 or 5 or 6 years of college and graduate. But I want to thank you so much for the wonderful day, and I especially want to thank Dr. Hawkins for his incredible hospitality he's shown me. And I want to thank his wonderful colleagues, both in the undergraduate institution and in the graduate institution, for hosting me so wonderfully. A set of rich conversations I've had today, and I will never forget the wonderful time I've had. And of course, I look forward to your questions and comments after the lecture. Let me ask you a question that I want us to consider together this evening. How might we, together, create spaces of hope in this world? This is the question I want you to consider with me this evening. I am a theologian deeply concerned with the future of Christianity in this world, and especially in the racial West and all those areas of the world touched by its legacies, as well as those parts of the world that have their own unique forms of racial reasoning and cultural xenophobia. I have been greatly concerned with the effects of racial reasoning, not only on peoples of the Africa diaspora and of European descent, but also its effects on the earth, plants, land, animals, and on how habitation is constructed and constrained by race. We Christians, we confess belief in creation and of a God who creates, not out of necessity, but out of love. That belief, dear friends, that belief, however, is yet to do any real work in shaping how we Christians see the world and understand the form of life that ought to characterize people who believe in a God who creates and has, through Jesus Christ, bound creaturely life to the divine life. We continue to live in the midst of an upheaval that we have never been able to comprehend fully or begin to address in any substantive way, and that is the devastating effects of private property and the spatial distribution of goods and services calibrated along racial lines. Race is a matter of geography. Race is a matter of geography. The vast majority of race theorists, Christian ethicists, theologians, and cultural pundits do not understand or appreciate this fact. This evening, I want to draw you deeply into the problem of race by drawing you deeply into the problem of spatial segregation. As Carl Nightingale notes in his epic text, Segregation, A Global History of Divided Cities, spatial segregation is an ancient strategy for constructing the world the way the rich and powerful wish the world to be. But since the advent of colonialism, segregation has also been more than a crucial strategy of control, containment, and exploitation. It has also been an important tool to help enact genocide. But not just genocide, but genocide bound to the concealment and ignorance generated by sequestered spaces. Now, everyone in this room understands the horrors of genocide. The horrors not only of genocide and violence, but we rarely see the connections of such matters to what I call racialized geography. Our sense of place and space has been racialized, and it functions unconsciously in our thinking. We could call it the geographic unconscious. There I'm playing off of philosopher and literary theorist Frederick Jameson's famous book on the political unconscious. And similar to Jameson's account of the political unconscious, the geographic unconscious means that segregated spaces function in us far more deeply than we realize or regularly take into account. We narrate our spaces with the distribution and arrangement of racialized bodies, always as an economic and emotional backdrop. Our thinking about the places we live and work, the places in which we learn and play, the places that are built up or torn down, anticipates patterns of movement of racialized bodies. In fact, our geographic senses are haunted by racial anxiety. Racial calculations and spatial calculations, racial calculations and spatial calculations have always flowed together in the history of the colonial West, and we yet live in the powerful undertow of that history. What haunts me is the way Christianity has been and continues to be complicit with and subject to this undertow. Christian faith and life continues to be driven by the geographic winds created by land developers, city planners, civil engineers, real estate agents, city government officials, and architects. We are, however, not simply passive spectators to the constant geographic turnings of contemporary life. We have performed our faith. We have performed our faith right on top of those developments, often presenting them as natural and normal ways of forming life and living in the world, when in fact, they have never been natural or normal. You see, there was a time, not too long ago, when peoples, especially in this land we call our own now, would have never imagined their identities apart from the land and the animals that inhabited their surroundings. They would have never, ever designated the land and landscape as inert, segmented pieces of the ground that meant nothing and could be sold to whomever had enough money. These same peoples would have never designated themselves as peoples, as black or white or something in between. This new way of seeing bodies and land grew on the ground of early European colonialism. It grew in those spaces where Christians from the old world came to the new world and realized their unprecedented power over indigenous peoples and lands. It was precisely this power over peoples and their lands that helped to form the racial imagination. The racial imagination that now clothes us grew out of a density of effects born of the moment when various peoples of what we now call Europe were extending their living spaces across the oceans into new places. As early European Christians entered these places, they fundamentally altered the relation of land to people. From positions of unimaginable power, they renamed the land, reorganized common life, and reformed the ecologies of native peoples. At the heart of this transformation was a world-altering reconfiguration of land, of identities, relation to land. As they looked out on their new domains, they refused to see those new worlds through the eyes of native peoples as places bound up with their bodies familied with animals. That's the only way to put it, familied with animals. For many native peoples who understood their bodies as deeply connected to the ground and what walked and grew up on it, to be understood as simply bodies floating through space, was pure chaos. These European settlers saw people separated from land and land in its potential for development. The land became private property, turned toward its evolution into productive earth. Europeans taught the peoples of the new worlds that they carry their identities completely on their bodies, detached from any specific land and animals. Once land and landscape were captured on a journey toward becoming inert segments of space that may be turned toward any use its owners desired, that is, private property, a parallel process would come into effect in which people became encased in racial vision. People were taught that they carried their identities wholly on their body without remainder. What a strange idea, that you carry your identity wholly on your body without remainder. The land, they were taught, no longer spoke to us of who we are and who we should be or could be. The animals, they were taught, were no longer kindred. They, that is, the animals, became simply our tools and resources for our use, and we became geographically adrift in the world, seeing places and spaces as simply undeveloped dirt or sites in transition to becoming something else. This way of treating the world meant that we have accepted a horrible calculus, the weighing of human life against private property and commerce. Only in a distorted world, turned completely into commodity, could a life be weighed against private property. Yet we hear constantly the comparison between loss of life and the destruction of property as though these things are on the same plane of moral existence. Black life, for example, has always lost out in that calculus because the ideas of law and order have overwhelmingly been orientated toward the protection of private property and not dark bodies. Law enforcement in this country has always been shaped toward organizing spaces of commerce by controlling the land, controlling spaces, and monitoring the movements of racial others. We live always in the midst of geographic struggle with deep racial underpinnings, where policing presence tasked with controlling space moves unremittingly toward confrontation with black and brown bodies, whether in malls, parks, neighborhoods, or stores. Most of us in the West continue to live oblivious to place and space. We don't sense space and the connectivity and relationality that are part of sensing space. Space for us is property, silent, private property. So life has formed in the modern world, cut off from the earth, the animals, and without any deep sense of the places of our meeting. And therefore, especially for Christians, without a real doctrine of creation. Christianity helped to form a vision of the land separate from the people. The land was to be possessed and controlled, and the people moved or removed to either not interfere or more likely support the cultivation of land, the extraction of natural resources, or the manufacture and production of goods, that is, commerce. What grew out of this horrific way of seeing people and land was a vision that made possession of land far more important than relationship with all those who inhabit the land. It created in us a reality of displacement as a way of life. This vision of the land as private property and of animals as objects of utility not only turned human energies toward control and exploitation, but would instill in us habits of fragmentation and isolation. We have been, since the early modern colonizing period, trained in anti-relational ways of seeing space, bodies, and people. Our minds have been guided by property boundaries, spatial mapping, geographic designations, and traffic patterns, not to see connections. A little station break for just a moment. My dear brother, would you mind looking in my bag? I have a bottle of water I meant to bring up here, but I forgot it. Thank you, it's in the bag. Thank you so much. My wife and I recently dropped our youngest daughter off at college. Woohoo! Thank you, my dear brother. She is our youngest, and with her going to college, we will become empty nesters someday, I hope. We'll see how that works out. She is beginning her freshman year at Towson University in Towson, Maryland, right outside Baltimore. And as I like to do when I go places, I wanted to get to know the area a little bit. Although I was only going to be there a short time, because when you're a freshman and you drop your kid off, they don't let you stick around too long. So you got to drop your kid off and then leave. They want you gone so they can begin the indoctrination. You must leave. You must go. So we were only going to be there a short time. But I wanted to see what the area was like. So I got on the main street that the university is on, which is York Street. And I drove as far as I could from one end of York Street to the other end of York Street. Long street. I didn't make it the whole way, but what I noticed is what you notice in almost every major city in America if you're on a major street. That street ran from big, beautiful, well-maintained homes, a fabulous mall, a wonderful shopping area with all these coffee shops, these bohemian coffee shops where students could sit and drink coffee till their hands shake and think great thoughts. All these wonderful places to sit around and drink coffee and have a good time. It ran all the way from that, all the way down that same street to torn down, dilapidated homes, boarded up buildings, and areas with few, if any, stores, areas that were food deserts, as they're called. That street ran from predominantly white neighborhoods to predominantly black and Hispanic neighborhoods. One street connected poverty and wealth. One street now showed lives in parallel, separate and unequal. But you know, there was one thing that seemed to move effortlessly up and down that one street through parallel lives, and it was the police. We passed police cars that moved up and down York Street. Now, dear friends, this is not by accident. Place and space for us are always designated, always designed. The spatial placement and configuration of land, property, and life, land, property, and life roll out together, shaped by a racial past and dictating a future. Like most of you, I was taught not to see what was in plain sight, that my world was configured by segregated spaces. The church has, for the most part, been oblivious to this reality and oftentimes supportive of it. We have been the high priests of segregated spaces, servants to the economic desires that create them. But economic desire alone is not the only driver of our violent geography. We live always in the wake of that energy called geographic whiteness. Geographic whiteness, with its desire to create communities that normalize white dominance. One powerful example of this in the United States has been the history and phenomenon of sundown towns. Now, a show of hands. How many of you in this room know what a sundown town is? Show of hands. Now, this is amazing. Thank you. You can put your hands down. Almost everywhere I go, there's only like 3 or 4 hands that go up, because most people don't know what a sundown town is. But let me just say, without giving away too much, if you are from the state of Indiana, you ought to know what a sundown town is. That might be why I've seen more hands here than I've seen in almost any other place. Sundown towns, my friends, were towns all across the U.S. that from the beginning of the 1890s through the 1940s purposely removed and kept out African Americans, sometimes Jews and Asians, from their towns. These were towns that aggressively sought to construct themselves as all-white communities. These towns, many of them, dare I say most of them, filled with people deeply Christian, constructed a geographic whiteness that permeated the earth, the land, and all their surroundings. And in fact, one historical note, maybe just a couple of historical notes. Almost all sundown towns were not in the South. They were in the North. They were in states like Ohio and some other states. Hint, hint. What most people don't know is that during what's known as the Great Migration, when so many black people from the South migrated to the North, the myth is that they came straight to the cities. That's a myth. These were rural people, and they looked for rural communities. The question you must ask is, how could so many black people who've come from the South to the North into rural communities wind up in the cities? Often it was not by choice. It was because of sundown towns. Let me just say, this state, shall we say the word rich, has a rich legacy of sundown towns. But I am, in fact, not talking about history, but of our reality. We yet live in the inertia of geographic whiteness. It is always important to understand whiteness here. It's always important to understand whiteness not as a person or a people, but as a way of being in the world and a way of seeing the world at the same time. Whiteness, not a person, not a people, but a way of being in the world and a way of seeing the world at the same time. Whiteness is not a given. It is a choice. What? Yes. It's not a given. It is a choice. Whiteness is not the equal and opposite of blackness. Whiteness is a way of imagining oneself as the central facilitating reality of the world, the reality that makes sense of the world, interprets, organizes, and narrates the world. And whiteness is having the power to realize and sustain that imagination. Did you get that? The struggle to control land and spaces and establish geographic whiteness is the untold story of American history. But that history marks almost every square mile of this country. Of course, not every town was a sundown town, but what they represented was a much wider reality, and that is the desire to control space. It is not that this country, city after city, town after town, was developed and then enacted racial segregation. Segregation has been a fundamental engine that informed and informs the planning, building, zoning, and organizing of the life flows of places. Segregationist tendencies are built into the ways local governments and land developers imagine space, which constantly increase disparities in almost every aspect of society. We yet live in the geographic history that we did not create. Sundown towns gave rise to sundown suburbs and to forcefully sequestered minority communities, and to the establishing of disadvantage, harm, and death geographically We follow the patterns that have established habits of fragmentation and isolation that teach us to be oblivious to what is going on around us. We have normalized the absurdity of grotesque disparity in quality of life, separated by only a few miles or even a few yards. But the answer, sisters and brothers, is not a few more mixed neighborhoods. Let's get clear. The answer is not just a few more mixed neighborhoods. What is needed is a new way of imagining social life by reimagining geographic life. A new way of imagining social life by reimagining geographic life. I think there are three things that we have to do. First, we must learn and tell the true story of the space. Wherever I go, I encourage people to learn the history of their space. What was here in this spot before this building? What was here in this spot before this school? If it's a church, what was here in this spot before this church? Who lived here? Who was moved in order for this to be built here? But there is a wider story that we must learn, and that is the story of the city or town or even state that we live in. We must learn the history of racial geography in our city or town. What has been the geographic history of non-white people in this town? Where did they live? Where were they told they could and could not live? When did that change? How did that change? Has that changed? How was and is geographic whiteness organized and established spatially here? How was resistance to minority presence deployed here? These questions are especially important for us to ask in the academy. It is especially crucial that institutions of higher learning, colleges, universities, answer these crucial questions because our institutions tend to create spatial segregation or ignore the spatial segregation happening all along racial lines, all around their campuses. One of the great dangers of the university, of every university in this country, is that it can more deeply inculcate students, faculty, and staff into the reality of displacement, where they imagine the university as a displaced space, where there is no working knowledge of the history of their place, no real sense of connection to the land and the animals, and no sense of relationality with the wider community. It is a terrible thing for a university to become a bubble within which you have your most elegant and pleasing and seductive and most wonderful, pleasurable intellectual experiences in a bubble. That the university is often imagined as an autonomous space, let me be clear, that's a good thing. Yet it turns horribly wrong when that sense of autonomy mutates into a geographic imperialism that means we become a self-regulating space that invites the world to enter our domain. It is precisely this geographic imperialism that feeds geographic whiteness and makes many schools across this country right now feel like inhospitable places for so many people. As I said to some folks earlier today, before a university can be a host, it must see itself as a guest. Before it can truly invite people into a new way of life, it must first show that it knows how to lovingly and respectfully and continuously enter into the lives of all those that surround its buildings, its structures, and its people. Few people who inhabit colleges and universities know the history of the place and space on which the school sits, and even fewer see the value or importance of knowing that history. But for Christians, for us, because we believe in a God who creates and that we are that God's creation, we not only want to know, we need to know. It's a part of our faith. We need to know this history because the social history of a place is inside its geographic history. That's where it is. More importantly, the root of most of the problems of any city or town comes back to this geographic history that shows us the history of the flows of goods and services, opportunities and disadvantages. What is crucial here is to learn the truth and tell the truth. Learn the truth and tell the truth. We cannot begin to address the racial disparities in this country until we acknowledge and even confess the geographic construction of disparity. I'll say that again. The geographic construction of disparity. We need in every town in this country, we need something like a truth commission that lays out in as much detail as possible the way life has come to be shaped in particular communities, neighborhood by neighborhood. As many of you know, in South Africa, after the end of the apartheid regime, the truth commissions, which were very painful events, very painful, tried to unearth the truth of what has happened. We need precisely that in every town. So first, we must learn and tell the truth of a place. Second, churches and schools should involve themselves in the geographic shaping and reshaping of communities. I would love to see Christians, especially Christians in institutions like this, start asking questions about the placement of buildings, the formation of neighborhoods, the designation and mapping of spaces, zoning policies, real estate operations, the plans of land developers, and so forth. Such questions and reflection should be a fundamental part of curriculum in every school, every university, every college, and a part of church life. We should invite everyone into discussions about the morality of geographies, asking whether we are perpetrating a violent geography by seemingly benign land development decisions. Now, of course, I admit these matters are very complicated, but the absence of a moral compass in these matters continues to have devastating effects on the lives of so many people. The compass that drives these matters now is controlled by local political economies, calibrated to race and racial ecologies, calibrated to the market. We need to invite people to imagine and build toward new forms of community and habitation that reverses violent geographies and challenges geographic whiteness. And finally, the last thing I would hope we could do. It is important to see the connection between space and discipleship. The great Native American religious scholar and theologian, Vine Deloria Jr., once said that Christians think temporally, but they do not think spatially. What Deloria Jr. was pointing toward was the historic problem of a faith offered to indigenous peoples around the world, especially in this country, that told them that time was far more important to God than space. After all, we wait for a new heaven and a new earth, don't we? It was and is a faith that believes strongly in the time of salvation, but has never really understood fully the space of salvation. The tragedy we all inhabit, sisters and brothers, is that our visions of discipleship, its reach, its quality, its character, are all controlled by the shape of our geographic imaginations. The issue here is how people imagine space and create living spaces. This is why it is so important that you and I understand hope geographically. We have to understand hope geographically. Christians too often think about hope temporally. We hope for a better day, a better future. But hope has an architecture. Hope has an architecture, friends. It is the body of Jesus Christ. He brought hope. He didn't turn people simply to a hope in the distant future. He brought hope. Imagine life and our lives constituted in hope within the constitution of that one particular life. One life that stakes out a space of hope, a space for all who enter, a space that wages war against the forces of despair. Imagine that. Of course, hope is always at risk, even in this fragile space created by the body of Jesus. Yet we are invited again and again to hope in Him. This is a common theme in Christian life and thought, but it is often articulated aimed at the future. Yet God offers us a denser reality of hope, a spatial reality flowing out of His incarnate life and His claim as creator on this creation. Hope then must be understood as a shared work of participating in the life of Jesus in the Spirit. This sense of hope needs to be understood not as private gestures of wish fulfillment, but work that must be engaged at the site of despair that join people together. The issue is not, do you hope? It is, from where do you hope? Where do you join people in hope? What spaces are you bringing to life that show hope? It is the spatial reality of hope that we learn through the incarnate life of the Creator. And it is this joining in hope on the ground with those struggling against despair that will end geographic imperialism and end geographic whiteness. Such real hope, spatial hope, refashions self-perception and reframes subjectivity. I do not simply have hope, but I find myself in hope. I find myself only as I enter spaces of hope. This, however, is community work. It is the heart of real community organizing. Imagine, my friends, imagine hope-filled spaces and spaces constituted in hope where we seek to know and love not just our theoretical neighbors, but our real neighbors. Such a possibility begins at the point we together decide to correct in our lives the grotesque absence of spatial awareness and challenge the forms of displacement that constantly turn the world and everything in it into objects on their way to becoming commodities. For Christians, but also for those who are not Christian, I want all of us to begin asking the question of vocation differently. Ask not just where should I be in this world? Where is God calling me to go? But more importantly, ask how should I be in this space, this place? How should I live in this place, this space against the history of geographic violence? How should we live in this place, in this school, in this university, against racialized spatial segregation? It is time for us, my friends, it is time for us to put our feet firmly and fully on the ground. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we have a few minutes for questions. If you don't mind, I'm going to sit. As I told people this morning, some of you were not there, they gave me this chair, and I appreciate it. I was swimming a few weeks ago, and I did a strange flip turn, and I kicked off with one foot, which you're not supposed to, and I felt something go, and then I went to my doctor, and I was hoping he was going to show me some sympathy. And I said, well, Doc, what do you think it is? And he looked at me and said, well, you're just getting old. So I don't like my doctor right now, but that's okay. So if you would, come to the microphone, tell me your name and then your question. And maybe if you're a student, what year you're in, if you're a faculty, what you teach. So please, come to the microphone, or if you can speak very loud, you're welcome to get up and speak very loud. Since the lights are I can't really see, so Rusty, if you wouldn't mind pointing to people and giving them permission to talk, because the lights are on me, so I really can't see hands that well. Okay, great.
Hey, I'm Kobe. Thank you, Reverend, for coming to speak to us tonight. And you mentioned that Christians often focus on temporal hope while ignoring the spatial hope.
Yes.
In your last piece of advice, you said we need to change our belief of that spatial hope. And how does a change of that belief kind of manifest itself? How does that come out in action?
Oh, and it gets back to the great question. How does a change in, not so much a change, but an expansion of our belief and hope, how does that come out in action? Well, it begins by we starting to pay attention and attend to where are the spaces of despair around us. And I think this is especially important for a university. Basic question, and students, you must ask this question. Outside the walls of this campus, where are the spaces of despair? That's not a difficult question. What often happens is that we become attuned to the ways we've been taught not to see what's right in front of us. And then begin to ask the question, how might we, with those who inhabit this community, because we are a part of this community, together with them, not imposing on them or doing something against them, how might we with them create a space of hope where there is despair? I want you to start to think about despair geographically. Think about despair, not just inside somebody's head, but despair in the way a place is shaped. As I was talking to someone earlier today, all across this country, there are places called food deserts. How many of you know what a food desert is? Every student, I'm not going to shame you, but I'm going to say this. Before the week is out, you need to find out what a food desert is. You need to find out what a food desert is, and I want you to find out, and it's not an assignment, I'm not going to grade you, but I want you to find out how many food deserts there are in this town and in this state. Food deserts are places where people cannot get affordable, healthy food. And they are all over this country. But that's a site of despair. You can't get a healthy meal. The only thing available are very bad fast food and stores that sell alcohol. So how might we change? How might we begin to get our minds around and become attuned to the way despair is created? Despair isn't just when somebody does something bad to someone. You can create despair by how a community, how a neighborhood is constructed, how a highway is built, how walls are put up, how houses are priced, how zoning happens. You can create despair. And these are theological matters. Another question? Thank you for that. That was a good question.
I'm a sociologist, so you are preaching to the choir here.
Oh, wonderful. I love the
and
choir.
I just am so glad that you went to geography, because I force my students to have to do the demographics of their hometowns.
Wonderful.
For my courses. So you see, you all, there's a reason why I'm doing it.
Wonderful.
Anyway, so thank you so much. I think you know enough about our town to know that we have stories that are hard. And this is one, I'm not an insider to Marion. And it's taken me about 6 years to feel like I can start to engage that story. Because as an outsider, you have to be really, really careful. And, as a university, I want us to be able to embrace some of those stories and be able to engage it, but it's not easy.
No.
We are a business, and we want to bring people here who feel good about coming to our campus. And I would just like to know, how do you propose, and every university has these stories. It's not like we're unique in Marion.
Absolutely.
And I'm just wondering, how would you suggest to us to do this in a way that's realistic, that is in keeping with what God would wish of us?
Wonderful question. You all caught the question. There's that great story in the Bible when the disciples come to Jesus and they have all these people to feed. And I'm sure you've heard some preachers preach this text so beautifully. And they said, Lord, we have all these people to feed. What do we do? And the Lord asked that crucial question. What do you got in your hands? What do you got in your hands? This room is filled with big brains. This room is filled with people who know how to create learning experiences. This room is filled with people who know how to turn horror into a teaching moment while honoring the horror. And the challenge is to draw on the collective wisdom and energy and creativity of a community to do this, right? It's a teaching moment, always a teaching moment. How do we draw it into a teaching moment? The key is to commit oneself to a form of education that says to students, we will educate you poorly if we don't teach you how to feel space, how to understand space. But now, more specifically, let me come more specific. One of the great things that very few universities do, and I've been to a whole bunch, they don't ask. They don't make themselves learners. In every community that surrounds every university, There are the women and men who know it all. They know the history. They are the storytellers. But you would be hard-pressed to find almost any university that invites them onto their campus to teach them the stories. This is not hard. It's a hard thing to hear, but it's not hard to imagine partnering with the community. There are people in this town that can tell you everything that you don't know about what was here before this school, can give you minute details of who did what, when, where, and how, and then say to you, now, here's what I think you should do with that information. The question is, will the community open itself up to the wisdom of the wider community? Will the teaching and the curriculum open itself up to seeing itself as a guest in a wider world before it sees itself as a host? If it does that, that would make that institution far more attractive to potential students than ones that continue to create bubble education. My deepest fear for so many schools, I was saying this earlier today, is that, and I put it in the form of a question, and I'm speaking to you students, and this is not a criticism of your institution, so don't misunderstand me now. It's not a criticism of this wonderful institution. It's a recognition that where all institutions struggle. Are we preparing you to enter the world in love and desire to join, or in fear and the desire to create sequestered communities that mirror what you had in college? That's a question for every school. And so the challenge for us is to think as educators who first are learners. As I talk about in my book, I talk about the problem of pedagogical imperialism. That's a deep sickness inside of Christianity. And basically it's the idea that we have been shaped into Christianity, a form of Christianity that imagines itself first as teacher and second, if ever, as learner, which is the exact opposite of how we should imagine our faith. We are first learners, and inside of a life of learning and growing and joining, we then, inside of it, teach. Inside learning. So it's time to start finding out who are the people. And sometimes these are people who are right on the campus, people who have been cooking and cleaning and working, and who are third generation, fourth generation people, and you know, no one's ever asked them, what do you know about that? Well, I can tell you everything, because, you know, I was born, 60 feet from that building. There used to be a hospital, or they can tell you the story. And it's a shame that there are so many places that's not even a part of the education. All right, I'm going on, but great question. Thank you, doctor. Another question?
I think you have time for a couple.
Just two more, that's all? Oh my God. Not going that long? Go ahead, my dear brother.
You right there.
Hey, my name is Brennan Sherman. You talked about the devastating effects of private property and rule of law. Systems that have used private property have resulted in longer life expectancies, lower infant mortality, higher GDP per capita, and they've done well on a numerous number of other metrics. Alternative systems usually result in millions of people dying. Do you have a suggestion for an alternative system that would be better than what we have now?
I missed the very first part. Could you slow it down and read that part again? You said,
yeah, so you talked about the devastating effects of private property.
Yes.
I'm just trying to find out what you mean by that. And if you know of a system that works better, I'd be interested in hearing about it, but I'm just not aware of any that work better.
A better system than private property?
Yeah, a system of private property rights and rule of law like we have in the United States and other countries that generally do pretty well and people have a high standard of living in.
No, we understand that private property is a recent invention, right? I mean, it hasn't been around all that long.
Well, I mean, in the Ten Commandments, it says, thou shalt not steal, so that's kind of implying private property rights, so that seems like it's been around for a little while.
maybe not. Maybe you're reading modern visions of possession back into the Bible. The idea that a person in perpetuity can own a piece of land is a relatively new idea. And here's two questions for us to think about. If people have lived and thrived for millennia without that new idea, then it shows that maybe it's possible not to do that. But the second thing to think about, and I'm not the only person who said this, I wonder if that is sustainable as we move into the future. Is it sustainable to think about a world in which it can actually be segmented in that way, so each person owns a little piece of the world? I don't know if that's sustainable when we think about water and land and the environment and animals and the extinction of so many animals. I don't know. Now, it might be, but I don't know if it's sustainable. And of course, the question you ask, what else is possible? That's always the crucial question to start to ask, right? Part of what we as Christians cannot allow ourselves to do, I don't think, is to limit what we imagine is possible based on what is. Because once we do that, that's pretty much the whole game. Once you say, well, it's private property or chaos. There was a time, let me give an example. There was a time when, in this country, people could not imagine an economic system that was not based on slavery. What else would you propose without slaves? But there are other possibilities. I have never been convinced by the narratives that want to lump all the things that we would imagine as positive based on things like private property. It's part of the capitalist narrative. All these things are possible because of that. Well, maybe not. But equally important, we might want to break down each of the things you said. So, for example, would Native American peoples, would indigenous peoples agree with that? About, certain things gotten better because of private property? Would indigenous peoples around the world right now agree with that? Obviously, animals can't speak, but, a number of animals have gone extinct. I don't know if they would agree with that. You see what I'm saying?
Animals that have been privatized or privately owned are the ones that don't go extinct. If you don't have any property rights to animals, they usually get hunted to extinction. And when you're able to own animals, that's when they don't go extinct. So no one's crying and all worried that we're going to lose cows or they're going to go extinct, because when there's private property, there's an incentive to conserve and to use and to take dominion of the earth like we're commanded by God in Genesis. So in order for the polar bears to not go extinct, we have to own them? Well, yeah. If you own things, there's an incentive for you to conserve them.
So okay, all right, but now, my dear brother, I hear what you're saying, but think about the logic of what you're saying. So you're saying survival depends on ownership. Think about what you're saying. Do you really believe that?
What do you mean?
Could survival possibly be imagined against ownership? And so let's say laws that say no one owns the polar bears, but you may not kill them. So let's just apply it to individuals. So if to own something is to have control over how it's used and what's done with it, right? So if you didn't own yourself, then how would you survive? Because you wouldn't have control over what you put into your own body or whether you nourish yourself or not. So if you can't have control over your own body, how are you going to survive? Or what's... Okay, I hear what you're saying. Do you need the concept of ownership for that?
I think it's useful.
I hear you. Listen, I heard
If you
say-
don't own yourself, if you don't own yourself,
Could there be a different way of imagining life that doesn't need either ownership or something that potentially must be owned? I mean, that's my question. But thank you for your...
but I'm still waiting. If you can come up with a system better than capitalism, let me know, because I would be interested.
I don't know if you have to do that. Do you? Go ahead. Oh, sorry.
You go ahead.
First of all, thank you for coming and talking to us about this. My question would be, so we talked about how in colonialism, the Native Americans had a better system and had this way of living on the land. How did it develop? Do we know how it developed in the European mindset?
In the what? I'm sorry?
In the European mindset that we didn't have this? Is the idea of private property and segmenting everything geographically something that happened with colonialism, or something that was already happening in Europe by the time they started expanding?
Great question, and I'll be brief because there's a couple of great books I'd recommend for you on but let me just kind of answer directly. So the antecedents are in the old world, in the way in which the feudal system worked, and in the way in which the king had property, had rights over land. Transposed in the New World, it became the basis for what we now call private property. The new thing is, rather than a king in perpetuity owning the land, in a sense, and here we trying to get to this dear brother's wonderful comment a moment ago, rather than imagining ownership in the way we understand it now, to understand that the king has the right over that space, right? In the new world, in which each person can, in a sense, become their own king, that idea became in perpetuity, someone can own this little piece of ground. And now, here's what's important. Indigenous peoples, when they imagined, in most cases, that they had entered into some kind of agreement that you could have the land, for the vast majority of them, as we now know, they didn't imagine that I was giving to you this piece of land forever. It was, for lack of a better term, it was basically, you may inhabit the space with me. But I don't imagine that, it's yours, an extension of your body, as it were, in terms of ownership, forever. That was a new thing. Now, for us, there's no way we can, as I said before, our entire consciousness is shaped around this as the only possibility. How can I imagine a world not like this? You're welcome.
I'm Brandon Hancock. I teach practical theology and ministry at the seminary. And when I'm not professoring, I'm a worship pastor here in town at the local Nazarene church. And one thing that's been so enriching to me, and this is the fourth session I've gotten to kind of hang out with you today, is your pastor's heart, which we've seen even tonight, and now you've responded to our questions. And I want to ask you a pastoral question. Or just a prompt. If you could help us, you've given us so much to chew on, and I'm still working through how the spaces that we worship in, like we did this morning, we could do that in this space, in my church, may kind of perpetuate certain geographies of whiteness, and our aims and aspirations for our churches that they conform to. We need to have a worship space that kind of looks a certain way, and educational space and a gymnasium and can you help us imagine for just a couple of minutes what we all know the church is not the building, but we inhabit these spaces and we need to approach them thoughtfully. What would a church space look like that is kind of imagined differently, that might, work against some of those trends and movements that perpetuate whiteness?
Well, that's a great question. And I think it begins with how all those who inhabit the church begin to connect to the space that the church inhabits and the space around the church. That's the beginning. The problem for us is that our ecclesial visions, our visions of church life, are inside of this geographic displacement. So very few of our visions of church actually touch the ground. We don't imagine a church as a life in a place. We imagine life in the church in that place, which is different. So I think the first thing to do is, before we think about the buildings, think about the neighborhood. Think about the dirt. Think about the flow of water. Think about the flow of goods and services. Think about where people live. Think about the rhythm of the community for the day, for the week. When is the community happy? When is it sad? When is there energy? When is there exhaustion? Churches need to feel their spaces, but we don't. So it's the strangest thing. We want to plop a building down, create a building to do all kinds of wonderful things without ever having thought at all about the very space the church inhabits. So if we thought about, let's say, let me come back to this example. Let's say we thought about the rhythm of the community. When are people full of energy? When are they without energy? When are they happy? When are they sad? How does the community breathe? And then start to think about, given the way this community, the rhythm of this community is, how it's shaped geographically in relationship to what's here and what's not here. What kind of building makes sense here? Now, that's very different, because most of the time we're thinking about, well, what do we want to do in the building? Okay, that's okay. Think about what you want to do in the building. But think about what you want the building to do. That's a very different way of thinking about it. As I always tell, pastors, and when you come to a church, the first thing you ought to do is put on some good walking shoes, and over the next 5 to 6 months, walk your community. Walk it. And pay attention. Pay attention to everything. When people get up, when they go to bed, when people are happy, when they're sad, what animals are around, what are the sound of the birds, what trees are around, what does it smell like? What's going on? What's not going on? Where is there silence? Where is there despair? You ought to feel it. And if you're a pastor and you have leadership, the whole leadership ought to do it with you. You can't do it in one day. So you take a few months, but you walk the community and start to feel it. And then from there, you can decide whether you have buildings that make sense. That's a great question, though, Pastor. Yes, my dear brother.
I'm a senior social studies and history major, and I'm going to get bogged down in the weeds again, kind of like Brennan did with just your research. You mentioned that settlement in cities from the 1890s and the 1920s was due to...
Sundown towns, you mean?
Yes, was due to the shunning from sundown towns, which led to city inhabitants. How did you gather that research, and how do you combat the research of quantitative analysis of the economic forces of the post-antebellum period in manufacturing and the push towards northern manufacturing and the deteriorating economic forces of the South and the agrarian lifestyle?
Well, those things are not in competition. There's a great book to read. James Loewen, it's the book, Sundown Towns, about 500 pages in which he goes through this. But you don't have to negate macro factors in thinking this out. I mean, part of what has always been at play and what's always difficult for theorists and historians to think through is that...
And economists.
Well, don't get me started on economists. I have my issues with economists, so I'm just not, I want to be a man of peace tonight, so I'm not going to start on my don't get me started on my, but, what's always difficult for those who want to do this kind of historical accounting is to give an account of the racial unconscious, right? That's what's, the history of zoning is is the history of racial reasoning. But now, if you go and you look at the archives and say, no, I don't see race here. I mean, of course you don't see race. I mean, zoning policies are in a sense, once they are put on the table, that's the end of a process of reflection that had racial reasoning at its very root. But you're not going to look at the history of zoning and say, okay, well, this decision doesn't seem like it's race. Well, you have to understand, the wider reality of what's taking place. But zoning policies are some of the, if you want to see the history of racist work in America, look at the history of zoning policies.
So is that how you did your research, was looking at zoning policies? That's what I'm getting, that was my question, was how did you gather your research for the statement that you made?
Well, there are multiple things. I mean, so James Lowen is a great example. Look at his book, because he draws on a number of different disciplines. But what you do is you have to, as with all matters racial, and both in terms of race and gender, you have to get multiple theorists doing their work in their own little silos and just put them in the room together in terms of your thinking, and you can see what they're all looking at but not wanting to say that they're looking at. You see what I'm saying?
So it's a quantitative analysis then?
Yeah, okay.
And a qualitative analysis as well.
And you can look at the history of zoning. We did this in class, Tyler. I showed you the history.
That's a great question, though. That's a great question, right? My dear sister.
Thank you for taking my question. My name is Laura. I'm a senior philosophy and theology student here.
Wonderful.
And my question is kind of bringing it back to the application. We've talked a lot about the facts. And my husband and I live in this community. Mm-hmm. We participate in this community, the Marian community that is surrounding this institution. And I know that there is a lot of hurt and a lot of bad feelings coming from both directions. Mm-hmm. A lot of people in this community feel like they have been displaced by this university. Mm-hmm. I'm not wanting to point fingers. I'm not wanting to place blame anywhere, but this is the reality. Mm-hmm. And I want to know, now that hopefully everybody in this room has at least come to a better understanding of how that happens, and hopefully have realized that yes, it has happened. Where do we go from there? How do we engage the community in a way that expresses our Christian sentiment of, sorrow for this thing? And how do we change our mindsets? How do we show this community that we don't want this, and we want to be working alongside of them? It's a hard conversation to have, and I just want to know your thoughts on bringing it to the ground level. Mm-hmm. What do we do?
Great question, great question. Well, I think the first thing, and I want to echo something you said, hold on to the sense of sorrow. I was saying earlier today that it is good to feel the sorrow of what has happened. We have been born into a world not of our own making, and we need to understand the sorrow and the melancholy of that. I mean, we don't get stuck in it, but don't run from it. Well, the first thing to do is to draw people from the community into this space and learn from them. Listen to the stories. Write down the stories. Draw on all these magnificent minds and the various disciplines to start to ask the question, what can we do once we learn these stories? How can we together with the community start to create a space of hope that begins here on this campus? That's always the important work. It's a work of vulnerability where you allow a community to actually teach you. And sometimes the way you can start to build a future together is to find the time and space to at least begin to mourn together. You can do a lot if you start to mourn together. Thank you very much.